Kids communicate in many ways from the moment they're born. They convey interest with their eyes and facial expressions. They can indicate when they're unhappy by making a lot of noise. The baby cries, the parent receives that message and responds. Over time, parents even discover the difference between their child's "I'm hungry" cry and the "I need my diaper changed" cry. Eventually, of course, the child will begin using words, even putting them together into simple sentences, but that won't start to happen for most kids until they're about a year old or later. But along the way, during that first year of life, there's a lot of thinking and social interaction that takes place. So my first suggestion today is that you complement that social interaction by beginning to talk with your infant, essentially right away, as soon as you meet her. Around 2 to 3 months, most infants can already turn towards voices and make gentle cooing sounds in response. By around 6 or 7 months, infants recognize their own name. They can use the tone of voice to tell you how they're feeling. And they'll even often begin saying strings of babbling sounds, ba 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 or da da da. Around 9 months, they can understand a few basic words. Probably not say those words yet, but understand them. By 9 months, their babbling will also include a bigger variety of sounds and a wider range of pitches. For about 3 out of 4 babies, the breakthrough to speaking, to using words, occurs right around 1 year of age, though there's nothing to worry about for children who begin somewhat later. That first word is usually a noun and almost always used in isolation, either a word like hi or uh-oh, or as a reference to some familiar object. A baby might hold up her bottle and say baba. A child might touch the family dog and say da. This is an exciting moment for parents. It represents their child's first foray into the world of vocal communication. It's a first step towards a deeper connection, both with the parents and the social world in general. That said, most children don't start to use verbs for a few more months after this first noun. Kids don't start to consistently use a verb and a noun to make a simple sentence until a little less than 2 years of age. Want baba or go doggo. Parents sometimes worry when the first word doesn't arrive on schedule around 1 year of age, but it's these 2-word sentences that are more developmentally significant. If children who reach 2.5 years old don't hit this milestone, then that's probably a good age to look into speech therapy, potentially to catch up. So you might be surprised, as I was a few years ago, when I was sitting in a restaurant and I saw a 10-month-old ask her mother for more milk. Now, the baby didn't use her mouth to issue this request. She didn't speak it, but she certainly used her words. She asked for more milk, using her hands. The 10-month-old was using sign language. The mother knew just what the baby meant. She picked up the bottle of milk and handed it to the baby. Developmental scientists are supposed to remain objective and resist saying that they know what the baby's thinking. We can see the behaviors of the baby, but not the thoughts. That said, I feel pretty confident that this baby knew that this short, imperative sentence would be understood. She didn't just haphazardly make those signs. She looked at her mother's face, waited until they'd made eye contact, and then made the signs. This is to say that this didn't look like simple operant conditioning at work. It looked like what it was, word-based communication. There's a very large community of parents who've undertaken the task of teaching their babies to sign, and with several good reasons. First, it's now clear that even young infants, even as young as about 8 months of age, can learn a vocabulary of simple signs and then use them to both receive and send messages from and to their parents. When parents try this, they almost always succeed. By 10 months of age or a little older, almost all children seem capable of learning and using simple hand-based sign language, well before they're able to use speech-based words. The second reason that parents teach their babies sign language is that it's just really fun. I mentioned that kids come into the world with a strong preference for attending to other humans. They're drawn to look at human faces more than at basically any other type of stimulus. And they look in the direction of human voices. Infants want to communicate. Babies, as I've described in this course, are seeing, hearing, thinking creatures right from the time that they're born. If there's something on a baby's mind, giving them an outlet to be able to communicate it to the people around them is just really pleasing for a baby. Making signs, and more specifically, successfully communicating, can make a baby very happy. In addition to being fun for the babies, it's also really fun for the parents. It's in our human nature to communicate with each other. Learning signs, even very simple ones, can lead to a stronger connection between children and parents. Along with these very immediate, fun reasons for teaching your baby and yourself some simple sign language, doing so seems to promote language development. Not just sign language development, but actual spoken language development. Children who learn sign produce that sign language at a much higher level than they produce spoken language. As a child learns more and more sign language, she'll be able to speak in longer, more complex sentences. As she learns to speak, at any given stage, there'll be a certain maximum level of complexity present in the syntactic structure of her speech. A child who knows sign language will routinely exceed that maximum level, however, when producing sign. One major limitation on children's language abilities, that is, comes not from their ability to reason about language, but rather in their ability to coordinate the rapid, accurate movements of the vocal tract needed to produce linguistic sounds. The basic unit of any spoken language is the phoneme, the basic, simplest sound. So b, p, st, g, so on. We string all of these sounds together to form different words. And then we string the words together to form sentences. For all of its complexity, the English language and all other spoken languages only make use of about 44 different phonemes. Every sentence you've ever heard, from every Shakespearean sonnet to every grocery list, has been a concatenation of just these 44 different phoneme sounds. While we only make use of 44 sounds, we put them together very, very rapidly. As I'm speaking to you now, I'm spitting out over a dozen phonemes every second or so. About 1,000 of these phonemes every minute. We make these sounds by pushing air out of our lungs, through our vocal cords, and then our mouth, and then filtering those sounds by rapidly shifting the positions of our jaw, teeth, lips, and tongue. It's a very automatic process by the time you're an adult, but it's worth giving it some attention when we talk about infants first learning language. Think for a few moments about how you make a ch sound. You hold your jaw relatively closed, you pull your tongue back away from the front of your mouth, and you push some air through your teeth. Ch. I can put some sounds on the end of that and make a word, chip or chair, for instance. Now think about how you make the sh sound. You hold your jaw relatively closed, you pull your tongue back away from the front of your mouth, and you push some air through your teeth. But wait, that's exactly what you do for ch. Ch and sh are almost the same phoneme. At this level of description, they're identical. But we can clearly hear a difference, and we can create one when we speak. When I say chip and chair, it sounds clearly different from ship and share. What's the difference? Have you figured it out? The only difference here is timing. If I make the ch sound and stop abruptly, within about 100 milliseconds or so, then the words are chip and chair. If I hold it just a little bit longer, an extra 50 or 60 milliseconds, then it turns into ship and share. Actually, it also matters how quickly I'm saying the other words around chip and ship. The ship was at the dock will have a very small sh duration. The chip was on the table will have a very long ch duration. The psychoacoustics here get really complicated, and I don't want to belabor them too much, except to make clear to you that speaking is a really impressive motor coordination achievement. It's easy once you're an expert speaker, but it's not surprising that it takes kids a full year to be understood, even with single words. Sign language takes this all out of the equation. There's still coordination involved in making a sign, but it turns out the sign for milk, opening and closing the hand while holding it in front of your body, is easier for an infant than producing the word milk with their mouth. When a 1-year-old, or even an 18-month-old, uses sign language, all of the distraction involved in pronunciation is reduced, essentially eliminated, such that more mental resources are left available for language production at the word and sentence level of processing. And voila, more advanced communication can take place. When you try this with your young child, You should start with words that are simple and words that are important to the baby. More is a great word to start with. Take your fingertips and simply tap them together in front of you. Speak the words aloud while making appropriate gestures. Do you want more milk? Kids imitate us all the time. Within a few days, if you do this, you're likely to see your child putting their hands together and apart rapidly when she wants more. It won't be a perfect copy of the thing that you're doing, but it will be recognizable. Milk is another common term that parents use. It works well once that more word is established as well. Sleep is another simple word that is very relevant to infants. You simply open your fingers up, hold them in front of your head, pull your hand away as you close your fingers. Medicine is another simple gesture. Holding the hand out, place the fingertip in the middle of the palm and rotate it in sort of a stirring motion. Diaper is a pretty important word in a baby's life. Simply take your index fingers and thumb as if you're grabbing your waistband and move your hands back and forth a bit. Finished comes up a lot too. You just take your two hands and make a gesture much like an umpire would make when someone's safe at home plate. Outside is a good adjective. Move your hand away from your head as you move your fingers from being open to closed. Dog is a good gesture. Simply tapping your thigh a few times is making a sign for dog that kids can learn to use. It's also a particularly nice sign in the sense that dogs typically respond to that particular gesture themselves, not just the parents. Drink is a nice intuitive gesture to use. Simply extend the thumb upwards and drink as if drinking from a bottle. Where is another one that kids seem to be able to learn really well. Simply hold your palms outward and gesture upward as if, well, when you normally ask a question to someone, where? In addition to the hand motion components of this, there's a facial expression component. You want to look quizzical when you say where. The facial expression actually can be important in general. If you've ever watched expert signers having a conversation, you've probably noticed this. The face gets used as an important part of the signing gesturing system, not just the hands. Once you have a dozen words or so, you can easily start stringing them together into simple sentences. The child will mimic you as you do this. The most exciting part comes when the child first strings their words together into a sentence that you've never demonstrated. You might never sign diaper finished, but if you're taking an unusually long time to finish the diaper changing process, your child might use those words to urge you on. There are many online resources that will get you started with the details of teaching your child some simple signs. My recommendation here is to start simple and be patient. As with speech, babies can understand a lot of signs before they can produce them. Some children acquire the words very rapidly, but others may take their time doing it. Ironically, it's the kids who are really good non-word communicators, kids who can tell you what they want with grunts and cries and facial expressions. Those really good communicators will have less need for these signs, and so they may acquire them more slowly. For what it's worth, you can also invent your own signs. In fact, there are many different versions of baby signs out there. If you know some, you might have watched or listened to my descriptions of them and thought, no, that's not the sign for dog that I know. That's okay though. The baby doesn't know that. You can invent signs and adapt them to your baby's physical abilities. For example, the adult sign for more involves touching the fingertips together in front of you, but for a young baby, just bringing two closed fists together may be easier, and it communicates the same idea. It's still something you'll be able to recognize. Most parents don't undertake this baby signing practice with the idea in mind that their children are going to progress into fluent American Sign Language. If what you're after is communicating with your baby, having some fun and promoting general language development, then it doesn't really matter just what signs you use. As long as you're consistent, the baby will be able to pick up on your own particular language. When this baby sign movement first took off, there was a particular concern that came up right away. Parents, pediatricians, and several researchers were worried that if children got really good at sign language, if it became their preferred method of communication, that it might actually hinder normal development, the normal development of spoken language. I mentioned that speech is really hard. It requires a lot of practice. Perhaps signing would sap some of the motivation to do that and result in speech delays. Several studies have put this concern to rest, however. One of the most notable was sponsored by the National Institutes of Health under the direction of Susan Goodwin and her colleagues at California State University. They recruited a sample of over 100 participants, all around 11 months of age. The parents of 1/3 of those participants were instructed in the use of baby sign language and encouraged to use it. Another third of the parents were assigned to a non-intervention control group. A final third of the participants were assigned to a second control group in which parents were encouraged to use verbal labeling more often, but they weren't encouraged to use gesturing or signing and teaching those extra labels. The children came back to the lab about every 4 months until they were 3 years of age. During those visits, the experimenters would test the children's ability to understand and use spoken language. The spontaneous speech of the children was recorded, for instance, for several minutes. It was tested in terms of their vocabulary use and in terms of the mean length of the children's utterances. How many words did they tend to be able to string together into a sentence or phrase? A picture naming test was also used to assess their ability to name objects and to point at the right target when they're given a particular label. The results of this and several similar studies have been quite consistent. Children who learned to sign with their parents did not lag behind their speech-only peers. It seems clear that learning to sign does not remove the motivation or in any other way hinder kids' ability to learn to speak. A close look at the data actually suggests that the children who learned to sign even learned to speak earlier than they otherwise would. Other studies have suggested that the language benefits continue as the child begins to speak in longer sentences. Ironically, by this time, around, say, 2.5 or 3 years of age, where these differences are noticed, many of the children and their parents have abandoned signing for communication altogether. It's great to have that sign language when you don't have speech available, but once we do speak it, it seems that this booster system gets left behind. The tip for parents here is quite obvious. You should try sign language with your baby. The more complex signing can take place once the child is 10 months of age or older, but you can start much younger, perhaps even 6 months of age, even earlier. The recommendation here with especially young kids is to use very slow, big movements with lots and lots of repetition. At first, especially with these very young infants, you might not get much of a sign language response at all, but it's really exciting when you do. I want to suggest 2 other evidence-based tips about language development for you and your young children in this lecture. My next suggestion is one that I might not really have to make. The research in this area suggests that almost all adults do this without trying. In fact, some adults have a hard time not doing it. You should also spend some time using motherese when you talk to your child. If you're a father, fatherese will also apply here. By this, I mean the sing-song, high-pitched version of speech that people associate with talking to babies. Most people wouldn't walk up to a baby and say, "Hello, baby, how are you this morning?" They would say, "Hello, baby, how are you this morning?" My final tips will be that you should spend a lot of time talking to your child right from the beginning as you would talk to another adult or an older child, and that you use cues from your child to help guide a conversation with them. You can include signing here, but what I mean to emphasize here is that you talk to your infant in regular, spoken, complex language that will be attentive to the interests of the child. Most people don't realize it, but infants learn a lot about the cadence and tonality of a language long before they learn the words of it. And talking about topics that are of interest to the child means that more of the language that you're offering is likely to be absorbed. Okay, so these are my suggestions. Before I get to the specifics of them, let's consider what sort of language ability children bring with them into the world when they're born. Obviously, they aren't speaking at that point, but can they understand anything? Are they even listening? There's some very good evidence that newborns have a strong preference for human speech over almost any other type of sound. A standard study procedure in this domain involves presenting children with the recorded sounds played from one or more speakers located to the left and right of the baby. Children have a tendency, from quite literally the moment they're born, to orient their head to face things that are interesting to them. Given a choice of a pre-recorded speech, standard speech, as opposed to, say, non-speech sounds, the speech sounds will get the most attention. While children are in the womb, they live in a completely dark environment, but they live in an environment that's quite rich in terms of sound. They don't emerge into the world never having heard sound before. They can hear digestive sounds, the beating of the mother's heart, her breathing, and sometimes the sounds of people talking. The sound of the mother's voice will be very salient to the infant in the womb. The fetus grows in a fluid-filled environment, such that many high-frequency sounds are not well conducted, but the lower sounds are very clear. If you ever listen to recordings made using a special microphone placed within the mother's womb, you'll hear talking that sounds a lot like the adults in the old Charlie Brown cartoons. Wah, 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 wah. The infant auditory system is built to receive and encode human speech, right down to the physical characteristics of that speech. For any human, not just infants here, adults, you can assess how well they hear by determining how loud tones need to be in order for the listener to hear the sound and respond to it. If a very high-pitched frequency tone is played, say around 10,000 hertz, humans can hear it, but the sound can't be too quiet. It needs to be at least 20 decibels or so to be audible. Similarly, humans can hear very low-pitched frequencies, say around 20 hertz. But again, they can only hear those if they're quite loud. Actually, with low sounds, it needs to be more like 70 decibels. In the middle range of tones, however, much softer sounds are audible. Even a single decibel would be plenty for us to be able to hear it. The threshold function, relating pitch to loudness, is shaped like an irregular letter U. And the point at the bottom of that U, the range of tones to which the human ear is most sensitive, corresponds very closely to the range of sounds that are made during human speech. It seems unlikely that this is a coincidence, right? With newborn infants, actually, this U is shifted a little bit in the direction of the higher pitches. That is, babies are better able to hear sounds in the high frequency range of human speech. They can hear those better than they can hear the lower ranges. This is largely due to physical properties of the ear canal and the eardrum when the babies are this small, but it has some behavioral consequences. If you ever want to get an infant's attention, you should talk to her while you raise the pitch of your voice, higher than normal. It's an interesting fact that people all over the world, hundreds of different cultures, do exactly that when they talk to a young baby. In addition to raising the pitch of our voices, we tend to talk in a sing-songy mode of speech. This is this motherese that I've been describing. The scientific term that's used here is more appropriately infant-directed speech. As far as we can tell, humans don't have to be taught to do this. They just see a baby, and when they speak to the child, this motherese just comes out. The characteristics of this special type of speech are also rather universal. When we talk in this way, we tend to change our speech in several important ways. First, we increase the amount of pitch change associated with certain vowel sounds. Our voice rises and falls more in pitch. We also tend to speak more slowly and clearly, and to use only very simple grammatical structures. It would be an unusual event if one employed high-level vocabulary in a complex grammatical form in addressing a young child, specifically an infant who is just learning language. It would be an unusual event, indeed, if one employed high-level vocabulary in a complex grammatical form in addressing a young child. All of this works to simplify the linguistic input for a novice language learner. By modulating our voices high, making them go up and down more, we accentuate the information that infants need in order to learn language. Earlier in this lecture, I talked about the tiny millisecond scale differences between ch and sh. It's easy to think of how a motherese version of this would accentuate those differences and make it easier for the child to discover. Look at the big ship, baby. Would you like a potato chip? Many studies have demonstrated something that seems quite obvious to most parents. Babies prefer motherese and direct their attention to the source of that motherese sound very consistently. Certainly, by 1 month of age, and there are some suggestions earlier, infants will look in the direction of a motherese sound longer than an acoustically very similar adult-directed version of the same words. Babies seem to be born with a preference for this motherese sound. Other studies have shown that somewhat older infants learn better from motherese speech than from standard speech. So not just that they prefer it, but they can learn more from it. For instance, in a typical study, 7 to 8 month old infants are presented with some novel objects paired with novel labels. They might see a melon baller. This is something you can find in any kitchen supply store, but it's something that almost no children have seen by 8 months of age, certainly not seen and learned the name of. The children would see a melon baller and hear a recorded voice say, "Look, a blicket. Hey, that's a blicket. Look at the blicket." Or the children might hear, "Look, a blicket. Hey, that's a blicket. Look at that blicket." After a delay, the child would be shown 2 objects, one of which was the melon baller used in that learning phase, and another of which was a novel object. A recorded voice would say, "Look at the blicket." For half of the kids, it would be Mother E's. For half, it would be a standard voice for these test trials. A child can demonstrate their memory for the name of this object by looking consistently at the visual target that matches that auditory prompt. By the way, I mentioned that we know infants understand a lot more language than they produce throughout the language development process. This particular technique is how we know that. Kids tend to look at objects that match the descriptions they're hearing. But back to our study on Mother E's. If the child was taught using Mother E's, they're significantly more likely to remember the name of that melon baller object. Mother E's doesn't just attract the attention of the infant. It's not just something babies like better. Mother E seems to result in better learning of vocabulary. The tip here is clear. If you want your baby to pay attention more, and learn more things from you, then you should not resist the urge to speak in that Mother E's baby talk kind of voice. I mentioned that I probably wouldn't have to tell you to do this. Indeed, my tip here is not to exert any effort to make yourself resist doing this. Patricia Kuhl and her colleagues at the University of Washington have conducted a wide-ranging cross-cultural study of Mother E's. They traveled the world, from the United States to Japan, Italy, China, Kenya, many other nations. There's some variability of the extent to which Mother E's is used, but it seems to be a nearly universal phenomenon. When faced with an infant, we slow down, simplify our grammar and vocabulary, extend our vowels, and accentuate our tonal variations. We humans seem to do this almost everywhere across the globe. Whether you speak in Mother E's or not, my next tip is to spend a lot of time talking with your infant, even well before your child has any ability to really engage as a full partner in this conversation. Our language consists of sentences made up of individual words. As someone speaks, indeed as I'm speaking this, you don't even hear a continuous stream of sound, but rather a set of discrete, separate words. Think about the last time you heard someone speaking a language that you don't know, maybe Spanish, Chinese, Russian. One of the first things that one experiences in that kind of situation is that people seem to speak that foreign language very fast. Also, there doesn't seem to be any break in their speech. It just rolls out, ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da. There just aren't any pauses in between the words. Well, if you didn't understand English, and if you listened to yourself speak, it would sound just like that. When we look at sonograms of people speaking English, we don't see pauses in the sounds that correspond to word boundaries. Indeed, if I put a break in between the words as I speak, it sounds very stilted and awkward. Studies actually demonstrate it's harder to understand speech like this, not easier. The reason we hear those breaks between the words isn't because there are breaks. We hear the breaks because we recognize word units and parse them out of that continuous, rapid speech stream. How do babies learn to find these breaks in the sound stream? How could you possibly even start to make sense of the word behaviors unless you could pick out where the words are? A series of studies by Jenny Safran and her colleagues at the University of Wisconsin suggests that it's a statistical learning process that's responsible for this. Consider the phrase pretty baby. They're two separate words. The word pretty occurs in English, not all the time, not even a whole lot, but every once in a while, the baby will hear that word, pretty. When the baby hears the first half of it, pr, it's often followed by t. Again, not all the time, but sometimes. The sounds pr and t tend to go together. The next two sounds in that pretty baby phrase are t and bay. Those two sounds very rarely go together. I might talk about a pretty flower, a pretty view, or a pretty girl. Only when the phrase is exactly pretty baby will those two sounds appear in order. The next two sounds, bay and b, are like pr and t. The sound bay might be followed by other sounds, but quite often, relative to chance, the next sound right after bay will be b. As infants listen to a continuous adult speech stream, Safran's experiment suggests that they're sensitive to just this sort of statistical reasoning. It's quite amazing, actually. Safran brought 8-month-old infants into her lab and played them a completely made-up artificial language. It sounded a bit like ba pi ti go la be ta no fe do go la ba fe ti go la be do ne te go la, and so on, for several minutes. Actually, you, just in listening to that for a few seconds, may have noticed that a particular sound always followed go. Did you hear it? La. Go la was a statistically defined word in that speech stream. Saffron presented 8-month-olds with a speech stream much like this for about 2 minutes, and then tested how long they would listen to speech streams which either had the same statistical structure or a different statistical structure. She found that when she shifted the word boundaries around, 8-month-old infants perked up and paid more attention. Even at 8 months, with just a few minutes of listening time, infants were able to extract at least some of the statistical structure present in an artificial language. If you give those same kids even more time, along with the gestures, facial expressions, and underlying meaning that goes with a real language, it seems very likely that they're able to extract a lot more statistical information than that. These infants are given no rewards for their performance. They're just presented with the sound stream and they begin to make sense of it. Humans seem to have a sort of language instinct. We just can't help but focus on verbal, linguistic communication and apply our cognitive processing to it. My tip is that you should make sure that your infant has a lot of linguistic input to work with here. The baby will enjoy hearing you talk to her and talk to others. Even though she might not say anything at all, she'll just learn about the language just from hearing you talk. As with many of my other tips, this one can and should be fun. One of the early principles of language, of conversation actually, is that people take turns talking. As you speak, you probably never think about it, but over the course of a sentence, your voice changes. You start at a relatively high pitch, and over the course of the sentence, drop the pitch and the volume. When you get to the end of the sentence, you pause, which sends a message to your conversation partner, almost like a dance partner. The message in this case is your turn. Babies often pick up on this particular dance step very early, even before they get their first word down clearly. I remember walking in the supermarket with my daughter when she was about 9 months old. I was talking with her, as I often did. "So, Jackie, what kind of ice cream do you think we should get?" I'm pretty confident she had no idea what I was saying, but she answered, "Ba ba ba." "Oh," I answered. "You like vanilla? We could get vanilla." "Ga ga ga," she replied. "I know, vanilla can be boring. How about if we get chocolate sauce to go with it?" Ha ha ha. My final tip today is relevant for any age. It's to engage in child-directed conversation. That is, allow what you say to be influenced by what your child is interested in. Supporting the emergence of your child's ability to communicate is one of the most fascinating and important parts of helping your child to grow. When you're having those conversations, you're helping to enhance your child's mental and linguistic development. When you look back on them, I think, you remember them as some of the best conversations you've ever had.